Sometimes all a man has left is a toolbox, a tired smile and a promise to his daughter that things will get better even when he doesn't know how. When a struggling single father walks into a small-town cafe hoping to wash dishes, he meets a woman who doesn't ask for a resume. Instead, she asks him something far more unexpected. What follows is not just a story about second chances, but about quiet courage, the kindness of strangers and how healing often begins in the most ordinary places. If you're someone who believes in the power of small moments in love, that grows slowly and in the beauty of starting over, this story is for you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories that stay with you long after the screen fades. Now let's begin. Struggling single dad applied to be a dishwasher. The female owner asked if he believed in destiny. The old pickup truck groaned as Dan Carter shifted in the driver's seat. Careful not to wake the little girl curled up beside him. A thin layer of condensation had formed on the inside of the windshield, distorting the view of the gray, restless sea just beyond the parking lot. Dawn hadn't yet broken, but the horizon showed a sliver of burnt orange cold light, promising another unforgiving day in coastal Maine. Dan rubbed his eyes with calloused fingers and sighed quietly. His back ached from another night spent in the driver's seat, his knees stiff and his heart heavier than either. He looked down at Maggie, her breath rising and falling under the threadbare fleece blanket she clutched like a lifeline. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold, but she didn't stir. Thank God for small mercies. He reached for the crumpled flyer he'd stuffed in the glove box the day before. The Driftwood Cafe, help wanted, dishwasher, prep, no experience necessary. No experience. He had more than enough life experience, just none that anyone wanted anymore. Dan stepped out of the truck, careful to shut the door quietly. The icy wind off the Atlantic sliced through his flannel jacket as he crossed the nearly empty street toward the modest wooden cafe that looked like it belonged in a postcard from a time that didn't exist anymore. Warm light glowed through its frosted windows. A chalkboard sign stood just outside the front door, the cursive letters slightly smudged by sea mist. Come in for warmth, stay for something more. He hesitated at the door, glancing back at the truck. Maggie would be fine for a few more minutes. She was used to waiting, too used to it, inside the scent of fresh bread and coffee wrapped around him like a worn quilt. The space was small but homey, wooden booths, mismatched chairs, a small counter lined with glass jars filled with cookies and biscotti. A few early morning customers sat nursing their mugs, reading local papers. One of them looked up, nodded politely. Dan returned the nod with a tight smile. Behind the counter, a woman with chestnut hair pulled into a loose bun moved with quiet precision. She was stirring something on the stovetop, the steam rising around her like a halo. She wore a dark green cardigan with the sleeves pushed up and a faded apron dusted with flour. Her face was younger than he expected, early 30s, maybe mid-30s, but her expression carried the calm focus of someone who'd weathered more storms than she let on. Dan cleared his throat. Excuse me, I'm here about the job. The woman turned, set down the wooden spoon and looked him over, not unkindly, but with a directness that made him straighten his shoulders. Her eyes were warm brown, sharp and steady. You the one who called yesterday, she asked. No ma'am, he said, just saw the flyer, I can start today. Right now if you need. She leaned on the counter, wiping her hands on a towel. You have any experience? Washing dishes, Dan offered a tired smile. I've been doing that my whole life in one way or another. She didn't smile back. Instead, she tilted her head slightly. Name Dan Carter. I have a daughter. She's 8. She's in the truck just across the street. We're between places right now. There was a beat of silence. Not pity, thank God, but consideration. Then she asked something unexpected. Do you believe in destiny, Mr. Carter? He blinked. Destiny? Yes, like people crossing paths for a reason. Things happening not just because they happen, but because they're meant to. You know, that kind of thing. Dan looked down at his boots, soaked from the melting snow on the cafe floor. I used to, he said after a moment. Back when I thought life had rules before it stopped making sense. She nodded slowly, fair answer. Another beat. Then she turned, grabbed an apron from a hook by the back door, and tossed it to him. Dish pits through that door. You can start by filling the sanitizer sink. Dan caught the apron midair. That's it, you're hiring me. For now, you break anything, you're buying it. Her tone was dry, but not harsh. I'm Evelyn, by the way. Evelyn Moore. Welcome to the Driftwood. He slipped the apron over his head, already moving toward the back. Thank you, he said, really. As he pushed through the swinging door, the warmth from the kitchen hit him like sunlight after a long storm. Stainless steel counters, industrial sink, a narrow prep table. Nothing fancy, but it was more than he'd had yesterday, more than he'd dared hope for. And somewhere out front, a woman who asked about destiny had just given him a chance without needing a resume or references. For the first time in months, something shifted in Dan's chest. Not a miracle, not yet, but maybe a beginning. Behind the fogged windshield of the old truck across the street, Maggie stirred beneath her blanket and sat up, yawning. She looked out the window just in time to see her father through the cafe window, scrubbing a metal tray with methodical care. She smiled sleepily and whispered, "Go, Dad." And the day began. The clang of pans and the rush of warm water became the new rhythm of Dan's mornings. The industrial sink was his station, and though the work was repetitive and unglamorous, it grounded him. Every plate he scrubbed clean, every spoon he polished, every tray he stacked on the drying rack felt like a small act of rebuilding, if not his life, then at least the scaffolding of one Evelyn Moore kept to her own rhythm in the front. She wasn't one for unnecessary chatter, which suited Dan just fine. She worked with quiet focus, prepping pastries and plating breakfast, with the calm of someone who had long ago made peace with early hours and aching feet. But every so often she would glance back toward the kitchen and catch Dan stealing a peek at the clock. She noticed it first on the third morning, expecting something. She called toward the kitchen window. Dan froze mid-scrub, sheepishly wiping a hand on his apron. "No, just checking the time. Maggie's still out in the truck. She's okay, though. Got her books and a sandwich." Evelyn stepped out from behind the counter, her brows drawing together just slightly. She walked to the front window and looked out across the narrow street. The old pickup sat with its windows slightly cracked and a paper bag propped on the dash. "No movement. You leave her there every morning?" she asked. Dan nodded, drying his hands on a towel. "Just while I work, I check on her during breaks." There was no judgment in Evelyn's voice, only a quiet decision. "Bring her in. There's a booth near the back. She can read color. Whatever, it's warmer than a truck seat." Dan hesitated. "I don't want to disrupt the customers. It's not a courtroom." "Dan, it's a cafe. People come here for coffee, comfort, and maybe a reminder that kindness still exists." He didn't know what to say to that. She nodded toward the door. "Go on." 10 minutes later, Maggie was sitting at a corner booth with a hot chocolate topped with whipped cream and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Her coat was draped on the seat beside her boots, slightly muddy, a pencil in hand. She was drawing something on the back of a placemat. Evelyn leaned in, curious. "It's a cafe," Maggie explained, "but in the backyard there's a garden with fairy lights and swings, and there's a big table where people eat cake and talk about happy stuff." Evelyn smiled. "Sounds like a place I'd like to visit." "It's your cafe," Maggie said matter-of-factly. "Never looking up, I'm just improving it." Dan, still in the kitchen, watched the exchange through the pass window. Something stirred in him, not quite jealousy, not quite hope. Just the strange sensation of seeing his daughter cared for by someone who didn't have to. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Evelyn started keeping a spare mug just for Maggie, and a small container of crayons appeared next to the napkin holder in her booth. Dan worked a little harder, stood a little straighter. He started arriving 10 minutes earlier, not because Evelyn had asked, but because it felt good to be somewhere he was needed. One afternoon, after the last lunch rush had trickled away, Dan lingered in the back, wiping down counters that had already been cleaned. Evelyn sat at the counter flipping through invoices, her glasses perched low on her nose. "You ever think about doing more than dishes?" she asked without looking up. Dan paused. "Like what?" "Prep work. Maybe some light cooking." "You've got good instincts. Noticed you rearranged the walk-in for efficiency. Most dishwashers wouldn't bother." He shrugged, a faint blush rising to his neck. "Old habits used to run a garage. Didn't matter how good your tools were if you couldn't find them. Evelyn looked up. Then you ran your own shop? Yeah, for a while, back in Pennsylvania. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't press. After a moment, she said, I'm not offering a promotion. Just more hours if you want them. The weekend cook's going part-time. Dan nodded. I appreciate it. Another silence. This one more comfortable? Then Evelyn added as casually as pouring sugar into a cup. You're doing good work, Dan, and not just with the dishes. He met her eyes. Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that healing didn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it arrived in the form of a child's laughter drifting from a back booth or a quiet thank you exchanged in the soft lull of an afternoon. That evening after closing time, Dan walked out to the truck and found Maggie already buckled in, clutching her drawing from earlier. She handed it to him. I drew you, Daddy. He unfolded the paper. It showed a man in an apron with a big smile standing behind a counter. Next to him was a woman with a ponytail and a warm face holding a tray of cookies. Above their heads were words written in a child's careful scrawl. The Driftwood Cafe, my dad's new home. Dan's throat tightened. He stared at the drawing for a long time, the paper trembling just slightly in his hands. As they drove away, the cafe lights dimming in the rearview mirror, Maggie asked, Do you think we'll stay here a long time? Dan didn't answer right away. He glanced at her, then back at the road. I don't know, honey, he said softly, but I hope so. And for the first time in a long while, he meant it. The storm hit in the early morning before the sun had a chance to rise. Wind screamed off the ocean like a living thing, slapping against the siding of the cafe and rattling the window panes. Inside, the soft glow of Edison bulbs swayed slightly above the counter, casting long, shifting shadows across the worn wooden floor. Dan arrived an hour early that day, soaked to the knees and gripping a toolbox he hadn't touched in over a year. The night before, Evelyn had mentioned in passing that the back room leaked when the wind blew in from the east. She hadn't asked for help, but Dan heard the worry under her breath, the way a mechanic hears an engine knock before it fails. He stood in the back doorway, now surveying the warped eaves and the small pool of water already forming in the corner near the fridge. The storm was just beginning, and he figured he had an hour or two if he was lucky before it got worse. With Maggie still sleeping in the truck wrapped in flannel and dreams, Dan got to work. By the time Evelyn arrived, hair windswept scarf trailing like a banner behind her, she found him on a stepladder, hammer in hand, mouth clamped around a nail like an old carpenter. She froze in the doorway, one brow arched, coffee in a to-go mug steaming in her hand. You planning to rebuild the whole cafe or just the part that leaks? Dan removed the nail, gave a quick grin and shrugged. Just making sure your fridge doesn't become a canoe. You could have waited for me, she said, though her voice lacked any real sharpness. You mentioned it, figured I'd fix it before it became a real problem. She stepped inside and glanced around the room, clean dry except for one stubborn puddle near the wall. The leak was patched, the eaves reinforced, and the wet insulation removed and stacked neatly by the trash bin. You always carry a toolbox around, she asked. Only when I want to impress the boss, he replied, climbing down. She almost smiled but caught herself. You hungry? He hesitated. I could eat. 10 minutes later, they sat across from each other at the back booth, Maggie's usual spot. The storm roared outside, but inside the cafe, it felt like a quiet pocket of warmth. Evelyn placed a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of Dan, then sipped her own coffee without looking up. You're not just a dishwasher, are you? She asked, eyes on the window. I used to be a lot of things, Dan said quietly. Mechanic, business owner, husband. The last word hung in the air like a feather before it fell. She got sick, Evelyn asked gently. Car accident, he replied. 3 years ago. One of those things where a drunk ran a red light and the rest of your life doesn't look the same after. Evelyn didn't speak for a while. Then she said, I lost someone too. Not to death, but to something just as final. Dan looked up. I built a restaurant in New York, she said, with someone I trusted. Loved, thought we were building a future together. Her lips twisted. Turned out he was building one without me. Took the investors, took the name, left me with the debt and the silence. Dan took a bite of toast, chewing slowly. That why you came back here? Evelyn nodded. This place was my grandmother's. She ran it for 30 years. It sat empty after she passed. I didn't have anything left in the city, so I came back. I thought maybe I could start over. They were quiet again, the kind of silence that wasn't awkward, but full of weight of shared damage and fragile rebuilding. Outside, a shutter flapped violently against the window frame. Dan set his plate down and stood. You want me to check the front? She nodded. Top right corner, always comes loose in the wind. Dan moved with purpose now, grabbing his jacket and stepping out into the whipping gusts. Through the window, Evelyn watched as he climbed up onto the short awning, bare hands gripping the cold metal, fighting the storm like it owed him something. By the time he came back inside, soaked and grinning, Maggie was wide awake in her booth, clapping her hands as if she just watched a superhero land. You're gonna catch pneumonia, Evelyn scolded, tossing him a towel. Worth it, Dan said, drying his hair. Didn't want your customers flying out the windows. You're assuming I'll have any left after this storm, she muttered. Dan paused. You will. This place is more than coffee and muffins. People come here for something real. They just don't know it yet. Evelyn blinked, caught off guard. Later that afternoon, once the wind had quieted and the sun broke through the clouds in fractured gold, Evelyn stepped out back to find Dan rinsing tools by the spigot. She walked up, hands in her cardigan pockets. You ever think about fixing more than leaks and shutters? She asked. Dan raised an eyebrow. Like what? She nodded toward the back garden. That mess out there, I want to turn it into a sitting area. Maybe put in some planters' benches. But I need someone who knows how to build, not just dream. Dan followed her gaze. The backyard was overgrown, half-paved, and scattered with rusted garden chairs and chipped flower pots. But in the golden light, it looked like potential. I could take a look, he said. Draw up something. Just ideas for now. Evelyn smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Let's start with that, he nodded. And just like that, Dan was no longer just the dishwasher who showed up in the rain. He was the man who patched roofs, fixed shutters, and saw beauty where others saw wreckage. That night, as he and Maggie climbed into the truck, he felt a strange sensation low in his chest, a soft, unfamiliar warmth. Not love, not yet. But maybe the beginning of belonging. By the time the first hints of spring began to flirt with the stubborn Maine coast, the Driftwood Cafe had taken on a quiet new energy. The worst of winter was behind them, but the memories lingered in peeling paint, water stains beneath the counter, and the smell of damp wood that no amount of coffee beans could fully cover. Still, there was a hopefulness in the way the early sun slanted through the windows and how the town folk lingered longer after their second cup of joe. Dan now worked 5 days a week, 3 in the kitchen, 2 out back, or fixing things Evelyn no longer needed to ask about. He had become something more than staff, though neither he nor Evelyn said it aloud. His hands still bore the grime of work, but they also carried a steadiness that everyone in the cafe quietly leaned on. And Maggie, now a familiar presence at the corner booth, had become a sort of mascot for the place. This particular morning, she sat curled up in her usual spot with a notebook open and a cup of cocoa steaming beside her. A plate of ginger cookies sat untouched, fresh out of the oven, courtesy of Evelyn, who discovered Maggie's love for anything spicy sweet. Evelyn passed by with a tray of cinnamon rolls and paused to glance at the page Maggie was scribbling on. Another drawing, she asked, smiling. No, Maggie said without looking up. It's a story. Oh, what about Maggie? Straightened proudly. It's about a girl who lives in a cafe with her dad. She draws pictures during the day, and at night the pictures come to life and dance on the walls. Evelyn chuckled, softly charmed. Sounds magical, it is, but she keeps it a secret because if people knew they might stop coming. That last line caught Evelyn by surprise. She crouched down beside the booth, her smile fading into something more tender. Why would they stop coming, sweetie? Maggie shrugged. People get scared of things they don't understand. Evelyn blinked at that. The girl was 8, but sometimes it was like she'd lived 2 lifetimes already. Dan emerged from the kitchen just then, wiping his hands on a towel. Mag's giving away the plot already, he asked. She's writing stories now? Evelyn said, standing. Of course she is. Dan gave his daughter a wink. She's got more imagination than the rest of us, combined. Maggie beamed. A few minutes later, with the morning rush winding down, Dan approached Evelyn as she restocked the display case with lemon bars and almond biscotti. Hey, he said, clearing his throat. I was wondering, I found a couple of old garden benches behind the shed. They're busted up, but I could probably sand them down, repaint them. Would make for decent seating out back. Evelyn glanced up. I thought we were still in the idea phase. Dan shrugged. Thought I'd move the ideas along. She gave a soft smile. Go for it. There was a pause, comfortable in its familiarity. Then Evelyn added, Dan, you know you're doing more than fixing wooden pipes around here, right? He looked at her, unsure how to respond. You're building something, she continued. Not just for me, for her, for yourself. Dan let the words settle before nodding. It feels good, he admitted. Like I've stopped holding my breath for the first time in a long while. That afternoon, after the cafe closed early for a supply run, Maggie lingered behind. Evelyn offered to watch her for an hour while Dan ran to the hardware store. The girl was quiet at first, flipping through a book as Evelyn took inventory behind the counter. Eventually, Maggie wandered over and tugged gently at Evelyn's sleeve. Can I ask you something? Of course, Maggie hesitated. Do you miss your mom? Evelyn's hand froze over a clipboard. Mine died when I was really little, Maggie said quickly as if to soften the blow. I don't remember her much, but sometimes I think my dad misses her so hard, he forgets to say it. Evelyn sat on the nearest stool. I didn't lose my mom the way you did, but I do miss her. Every day, especially in here. She used to sit in the window seat with a crossword and scold me for using too much nutmeg. Maggie smiled. You do use a lot of nutmeg. Exactly, Evelyn said, smiling back. Maybe it's my way of keeping her around. Maggie climbed onto the stool beside her. I think when you love someone, they're always kind of here. Even when they're gone, Evelyn reached for the girl's hand and held it gently. You're a wise little soul. Maggie Carter. The bell above the door jingled and Dan stepped in, holding a bag of garden tools and a roll of wire fencing. He paused at the sight of his daughter sitting beside Evelyn. Both of them bathed in the soft golden hue of the afternoon light, their hands still loosely clasped. He didn't say anything at first, just set the bag down and watched. There was something fragile and beautiful about that moment, something he didn't want to disturb. Later that night, after they'd parked the truck by the beach and Maggie had fallen asleep in the back under her quilt, Dan stayed up a little longer, sketching on a notepad Evelyn had given him. He drew out plans for the garden seating area, but his mind wasn't entirely on measurements or wood grain. He kept thinking about the way Evelyn had looked at Maggie, the way she'd spoken to her, not like a stand-in for her mother, not like a customer's kid, but like someone who truly mattered, someone she saw. The wind had died down and the stars blinked overhead, faint but insistent. Dan leaned back in the driver's seat, exhaled and looked toward the cafe down the road, its lights long since dimmed. There were still things he didn't know how to name, feelings he wasn't ready to untangle. But the ache in his chest was beginning to feel less like grief and more like something growing. He closed his notebook and whispered almost to himself, maybe we're not so lost after all. The week started with promise, brighter mornings, stronger coffee, and customers who lingered a little longer at the window tables Dan had finally finished sanding and painting two of the benches from the overgrown lot behind the cafe, and Maggie had begun decorating laminated table signs with hand-drawn flowers and cartoon muffins. Evelyn, though still guarded in her usual calm, had been humming under her breath during morning prep. A small sign of joy, almost imperceptible unless you were watching closely. Dan noticed the Driftwood Cafe felt alive again. But by Thursday, the spell broke. It started with Evelyn standing motionless behind the counter, her brows furrowed as she scrolled through her phone. Dan had just come in through the back with a bucket of garden tools when he spotted her. He was about to call out, but something in her posture made him pause. The stillness, the tension in her jaw. She turned the screen toward him, a glowing red badge on the cafe's online review profile. 1 star, Dan read the accompanying review aloud. Overpriced for what it is. Staff is inattentive. Found a hair in my scone. Won't be coming back. He glanced up. That's not true. Evelyn didn't respond. Her lips were pressed in a tight line, and her shoulders had gone rigid. He stepped closer. Who was it? Do you recognize the name? She shook her head. Just a first name and a blurry profile photo, could be anyone. But that doesn't matter, people see the stars. Not the details. Dan hated how calm her voice sounded. It was the kind of calm that came just before something cracked. Later that morning, the usual Thursday crowd thinned. The couple from the bookstore down the road didn't show. The three older ladies who played dominoes at the back booth didn't show. Even the young woman who worked across the street and always came in for a chai latte and Wi-Fi sat outside in her car for a few minutes before pulling away. By noon, the cafe was nearly empty. Evelyn didn't say anything. She kept moving, wiping counters that didn't need cleaning, rechecking inventory, restacking muffins and trays no one was touching. Dan tried to keep the energy up, making light jokes with Maggie tidying the garden seating area, even offering to run a lunch delivery to the hardware store. But the air was different now. Stagnant, disappointed. It was mid-afternoon when the final blow landed. "I need to show you something," Dan said quietly. Joining Evelyn at the prep counter, he held out the cafe's weekly expense report. Numbers highlighted, receipts clipped. "We've got 2 weeks before we hit the red," he said gently. "3 if we cut back on supplies." Evelyn didn't look at the paper. She stared at the sugar canister, unmoving. "I can loan some hours back." Dan offered. "I can pick up part-time work elsewhere. Maybe the gas station off Route 9. We'll get through this." Still she didn't speak. Then suddenly she turned and walked briskly toward the office door at the back of the cafe, disappearing inside. The door clicked shut behind her. Dan waited. A minute. 2. Then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of a quiet sob, muffled by a hand, or maybe a sleeve. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp, raw. The kind of sob someone releases only when the weight has become too much. He stood there for a moment, frozen. This was her sanctuary, her escape from a past that had stolen everything. And now here it was again, taking from her, with the cruelty of anonymity and algorithms. He knocked softly on the door. No answer. He opened it anyway. Evelyn was sitting on the floor beside the filing cabinet, legs pulled to her chest, forehead resting on her knees. When she looked up, her face was red, eyes glassy but dry. "I'm sorry," she said hoarsely. "I didn't mean for you to hear that." Dan didn't say anything right away. He sat down across from her on the floor, legs, outstretched arms resting on his knees. "I used to have days like this," he said after a while. "Back at my garage, days where no one came in. Or worse, when someone did come in just to scream at me for something I didn't do." She looked at him skeptical. "I'd sit in the back room with the lights off and convince myself I was a fraud, that I'd fooled everyone into thinking I was worth something." He paused, but then Maggie would come in wearing one of those ridiculous plastic tiara, holding a peanut butter sandwich, and say, "Daddy, can we fix stuff today?" And I'd remember someone still believed in me. Evelyn's face softened just slightly. Dan leaned forward. "You built something real here, Evelyn. Not just a business, a community, the regulars, the kids who color at the booths, the truckers who call ahead for pie slices, that can't be undone by one bad review. Don't let this break you." Evelyn drew a shaky breath. "It's just, I've failed once before. Big, and I thought if this place went under, at least it would be on my terms. Not because of some stranger with a phone." Dan nodded. "Then let's fight back. Not with words, but with action." She looked at him, puzzled. "Let's trim the menu. Highlight the best sellers. Maggie and I can help repaint the outside this weekend. Make it look fresh. You've got a community here. They just need a reason to come back." Evelyn hesitated, and if they don't, Dan met her eyes. "Then we keep showing up anyway. You did that for me. Let me do that for you." The moment held quiet and true. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped into the ocean and the sky turned to ash, Dan and Evelyn stood outside the cafe with Maggie, who clutched a piece of paper in her hands. "What's that?" Evelyn asked. Maggie held it up, a sign drawn in careful block letters and decorated with smiling mugs and muffins. "We're still here. Come in for warmth. Leave with a smile." Evelyn knelt and wrapped her arms around the girl, and this time she cried without shame. The snow had returned, soft at first flurries, tracing lazy circles over the cafe's windows, but by mid-afternoon it had become serious, stacking in thick layers on rooftops and turning the narrow sidewalks of town into slushy obstacle courses. The Driftwood Cafe, which had been slowly regaining its steady rhythm, now faced the hush of an impending storm. Dan shoveled the walkway in front of the cafe with broad, deliberate strokes, his breath coming in clouds, the scrape of metal against concrete. Rhythmic and calming, Evelyn had closed early. Most businesses on the block had. By the time he finished, the street was nearly deserted. Quiet in that particular way, only snowstorms could bring muted intimate, like the world was holding its breath. Inside, Evelyn was wiping down the counter more slowly than usual, her movements unfocused. Maggie sat nearby, sketching what looked like a snowman made of muffins. "Forecast says we might lose power tonight," Evelyn said when Dan came back, in stamping snow from his boots. "Winds picking up could hit 30 miles an hour after sunset." Dan nodded, peeling off his gloves. "You heading home soon?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to look out the window. "My place is at the edge of town. Not exactly snowplow friendly." He followed her gaze. "You're not thinking of staying here overnight. I've done it before," she said almost defensively. "The back office has a cot, got some extra blankets in the storage closet." Dan frowned. "You shouldn't be alone in this kind of weather." "I'm not afraid of snow," she said, but her voice carried the weariness of someone who had learned to be brave, simply because there was no one else to do it for her. "I know," Dan replied, "but still, you don't have to be alone." She looked at him as if trying to gauge whether he meant what he said, but before she could answer, a gust of wind howled past the windows, rattling the frame. "Truck's got a full tank," he added, "but it's no place for Maggie in a storm. Not overnight, if you don't mind. We could stay here too. I'll keep the fire going, make sure the pipes don't freeze. We'll be out of the way." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, but if Maggie starts a marshmallow fire on the stovetop, I'm blaming you." Dan grinned. "Deal." They set up camp in the back office. Dan rolled out a sleeping bag near the heater, and Maggie claimed the cot wrapped in 3 layers of blankets and happily munching on a chocolate chip cookie. Evelyn had saved just in case. Evelyn brewed a fresh pot of coffee and poured it into thermoses. The snow continued to fall outside, heavy and relentless. Later that evening, after Maggie had drifted to sleep with a sketch pad resting on her chest, Dan stepped into the main dining room and found Evelyn sitting at a table near the window, a book open but unread in her hands. "You okay?" he asked, settling into the seat across from her. She looked up, surprised to see him still awake. "Yeah, just thinking about." She closed the book. "How different my life looks from what I imagined." Dan nodded slowly. "I get that. I used to think success meant a 5-star restaurant in Manhattan." She continued, her voice quieter now, more raw. "Reservations booked months in advance. Critics writing about my truffle risotto. I thought that's what made me real." She smiled, but it was bittersweet. "But now, I'm in a roadside cafe in a town half the country forgot existed, baking scones for truckers and pouring coffee for fishermen. And some days I wonder if I've disappeared. If I traded in a spotlight for invisibility." Dan leaned forward. "You didn't disappear, Evelyn. You chose to stay visible in a place that actually sees you. That's not failure, that's courage." She blinked, caught off guard by the gentleness in his tone. "I used to think being a good father meant having a house, a stable job, health insurance." He said, his voice rougher now. "But when I lost all that, Maggie didn't ask for any of it back. She just asked if I'd be there the next morning." He paused, his eyes meeting hers. "I've come to believe the people who really love you, they don't measure you by what you've lost, only by what you keep showing up for." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moaned through the cracks in the eaves, and snow tapped against the windows like tiny ghostly fingers. Then Evelyn asked so softly it was almost lost beneath the storm, "Do you ever think you were meant to come here?" Dan's breath caught. He didn't know how to answer. So he didn't, not with words. Instead, he reached across the table, gently covering her hand with his. The silence between them wasn't empty now. It was full of things unsaid, of resilience and kindness, of grief and healing, of 2 people who hadn't looked for each other, but had somehow found something solid amidst the drift. When the power flickered and then cut out entirely, Evelyn didn't flinch. Dan stood and grabbed a flashlight, handing it to her. "I'll check the fuse box," he said. "You stay here, I'll be right back." She nodded, her fingers still tingling from the warmth of his hand. Outside, the cafe faded into darkness, swallowed by the storm. But inside, even with the lights gone and the night pressing in from all sides, there was still warmth. Not from electricity, from something far more powerful. And as Evelyn sat there in the dim golden glow of the flashlight beam, listening to Dan's footsteps return from the basement, she realized something quietly astonishing. For the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of the dark winter, loosened its grip reluctantly as if the town of Halberton had to prove itself worthy of warmth. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the snow began to recede from the sidewalks. Buds appeared on the brittle branches outside the Driftwood Cafe, and light returned with a softness that made people pause longer. By windows, sip coffee, slower, smile easier. Dan had rebuilt the garden benches and placed them neatly in the back lot, transforming the once neglected patch of land into something that almost resembled charm. A few strings of borrowed fairy lights hung between posts, and fresh mulch lined the narrow flower beds. The space didn't look like much to a stranger, but to those who had watched the cafe through the bleakness of winter, it looked like hope. Inside the cafe was preparing for something new. "We're really doing this?" Evelyn asked, standing by the register as Dan arranged folding chairs in the small space near the front windows. He gave her a grin. "You said yes 3 times already." Yes to an open mic night. "I didn't say yes to rearranging half the cafe and inviting the whole town to watch me pretend I'm not terrified," Dan shrugged. Too late. Maggie made posters. Evelyn looked over at the chalkboard sign by the door, where in a colorful swirl of handwriting it now read, "Saturday night open mic at the Driftwood, share your voice. Share your heart cookies, provided share your heart." Evelyn repeated, raising an eyebrow. "She insisted," Dan said. As if on cue, Maggie twirled into the cafe, clutching a stack of hand-drawn programs. "I made a list of who's performing. I'm first you." Evelyn asked, "I'm going to read a poem I wrote for my dad." Dan choked slightly on his coffee. "Wait, you are?" Maggie nodded proudly. "It's a surprise, though. You can't see it until I'm on stage." Saturday arrived with a soft breeze and the scent of thawing earth. As evening fell, the cafe filled slowly. Regulars took their usual seats. Families pulled chairs closer together. Teenagers hovered near the cookie trays. Fairy lights flickered. Music played low from the speaker in the corner. And for once, the cafe felt like something larger than just a business. It felt like a community. Dan stood at the back, wiping his hands on his jeans as he scanned the crowd. Evelyn was by the espresso machine composed on the outside, but he could tell she was buzzing underneath. This was a leap for her, opening the doors, not just for business, but for connection. "Ready?" he asked quietly as he stepped beside her. "Not even a little good." "That means you care." She exhaled, gave him a glance that was half annoyance, half gratitude. "Go sit, it's starting." Maggie was first. She stood on a small platform with her sneakers barely reaching the edge, and clutched her notebook like it held her whole soul. The room hushed. "My poem," she said, her voice steady but soft, "is called 'The Man Who Never Quit.'" Dan leaned forward instinctively. Maggie began to read, each word clear and full of unguarded truth. "He fixes more than broken things, like wobbly chairs and garden swings. He fixes days that feel too long, with quiet work and being strong." A few in the audience exchanged gentle smiles. "He holds me close when nights are cold, tells stories I've already told. He makes me laugh when I feel small. He's the bravest man of all." Dan felt his throat tighten. "He doesn't wear a hero's cape or have a fancy house or lake. But he's my home, my solid ground. The best dad that I've ever found." The room was completely still. Maggie closed her notebook. "Thank you." Thunderous applause followed. Not just polite, but real moved. Maggie ran into Dan's arms as soon as she stepped down, and he lifted her, easily pressing a kiss to her hair. "I love you, kiddo," he whispered, eyes wet. "I know," she whispered back. Evelyn stepped onto the stage next, a little stiff, a little flushed. She cleared her throat. "I don't have a poem," she began, "but I do have a few things to say." The room quieted again. "When I reopened this cafe, I told myself I was doing it for the business, to pay off debts, to reclaim something I lost. But over the past few months, I've realized it's more than that." Her voice trembled slightly, but she held firm. "It's become a place where people come to feel seen, where kids draw on placemats, where cookies fix heartbreaks, where strangers leave a little less alone than they arrived." She looked at Dan then, "And I didn't build that alone." Dan met her eyes, something unspoken passing between them, a shared acknowledgement of what they'd both been through to stand here now. After the applause, music resumed. People mingled and laughter returned to the walls. Dan stepped outside for some air, only to find Evelyn joining him moments later. "You did good in there," he said. "You mean I didn't faint?" "That too." They stood side by side, the night quiet but full. The garden lights behind them glowed. The breeze smelled of earth and early blossoms. Evelyn turned to him, voice lower now. "You know, I used to think if I ever fell for someone again, it'd be fast, fireworks, chaos, something out of a movie. And now I think it might feel like this, slow, steady. A man fixing shutters in a snowstorm, teaching his daughter how to plant tulips. Showing up when no one asked." Dan's voice was quiet. "That sounds a lot like love." Evelyn didn't reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she reached for his hand, and he took it, no hesitation. In the distance inside the warm walls of the cafe, Maggie laughed. And just like that spring truly began, May arrived with a false promise of peace. For weeks, the weather had held steady sunlight, thick with golden warmth. The garden benches behind the Driftwood Cafe finally hosting quiet conversations over pie and lemonade. Dan had even planted a line of daffodils along the back fence with Maggie, each bloom standing like a little soldier announcing spring's full arrival. But as with most things that seemed too steady, the change came fast. It started with a sharp shift in the wind on a Wednesday afternoon. Dan noticed it first stepping outside to bring in the chalkboard sign, when the breeze tugged at it with more force than usual. The sky had gone from robin's egg blue to a flat steel gray in under an hour. Weather warnings crackled over the radio. Evelyn turned up the volume behind the counter, frowning as she listened. "Severe thunderstorm watch," she said almost to herself. 50-mile-an-hour gusts. Possible hail. Dan leaned against the counter. "You want to close early?" Evelyn hesitated. "We've got a dinner crowd tonight, someone's retirement party. They've already set up the back table." Dan glanced toward the rear of the cafe. Balloons, a homemade banner, and 3 generations of one family had just begun gathering. He nodded. "All right, we'll watch it. I'll secure the benches and the back door." As the evening wore on, the wind escalated. It howled like something feral around the corners of the building, slamming against the windows in angry bursts. The party carried on, though more subdued than planned. Cake slices passed a little quicker. Conversations lowered beneath the distant rumble of approaching thunder. Dan checked the roofline 3 times, climbed onto the porch to tighten down the awning, and moved Evelyn's herb planters inside. He double-bolted the back entrance. But by the time the final guests said their goodbyes, lightning had begun to split the sky with terrifying regularity. "Go home, Dan," Evelyn said, wiping sweat from her brow. "Take Maggie, I'll lock up." Dan shook his head. "I'll wait it out here. Truck's not safe in this kind of wind, and Maggie's already asleep in the back. I can manage. I'm not worried about the cafe," he said gently. "I'm worried about you." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. The truth sat between them, wordless but known. The storm hit full force just after midnight. A deafening crack split the air, followed by a thunderous crash. Dan jumped from the cot in the back, heart in his throat. Evelyn, already half-dressed in her cardigan, met him in the hallway. "The porch," she said breathlessly. "It's gone." They raced through the front door and stopped cold. Where there had once been the small covered porch with its handmade sign and flower boxes, now only debris. The awning had collapsed, shards of wood scattered across the sidewalk. One of the window panes had cracked. A section of the roof had peeled upward like a flipped page in a forgotten book. Evelyn covered her mouth. Dan stepped forward, barefoot, standing ankle-deep in wind-blown leaves and splinters. He turned back toward her. "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes shimmered. "It's not the damage," she whispered. "It's the feeling." "What feeling?" "Like I've seen this before." The moment something starts to grow, something always tears it apart. Dan walked to her, slowly brushed wind-tangled strands of hair behind her ear. "You haven't failed," he said. "This storm didn't come for you. It just came, and we're still standing." She looked at him, her face drawn and pale. "You said, 'we,'" she murmured. Dan gave a tired smile. "We rebuilt the garden, we fixed the roof, we made it through winter. So yeah." We a beat passed, and then she collapsed against him. Not from weakness, but from relief. from the weight of too many years holding everything up on her own. Dan wrapped his arms around her, steady and warm, grounding her like an anchor in wind-tossed seas. By dawn, the wind had stilled. The world outside was sodden and broken in places, but calm. Maggie helped collect the scattered flower boxes, carrying them one by one to the back. Dan assessed the structural damage while Evelyn called the insurance adjuster. Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, townsfolk began arriving with toolboxes, nails boards. The bookstore owner brought a thermos of hot cider. Two brothers from the hardware store offered extra shingles. A retired contractor Evelyn had served every Thursday brought a saw and a truckload of good intentions. No one asked questions. No one asked for payment. They just showed up. Dan stood back and watched as strangers became a crew, then a community. Evelyn moved among them like a conductor, grateful, directing, stunned by the generosity. "You started something here," Dan said quietly, stepping up beside her. She shook her head. "We did." That night the porch was still gone, but its foundation was solid again. The windows were boarded temporarily, the lights inside flickering with candle glow and backup battery packs. The cafe stayed open, if only for tea and quiet conversation. Dan sat at the corner booth, sipping from a chipped mug, watching Maggie draw a new picture of the driftwood, this time with stronger walls, brighter skies. Evelyn approached him, weary but smiling. "I'm tired," she admitted. "You've earned it." She tilted her head. "Why do you stay, Dan? You never ask for anything. You fix, you build, you show up. But you never ask." Dan looked into his mug, then at her. "Because somewhere along the way he said this became home. And I don't walk away from home, not anymore." Evelyn didn't reply. She just reached for his hand and held it. The new porch went up in 2 days flat. By the end of the week it was better than before, sturdier, wider, built from donated lumber and neighborly goodwill. Dan added personal touches: a carved wooden beam salvaged from an old barn planter, boxes Maggie painted with wild, uneven daisies, and a wind chime Evelyn had tucked away since her grandmother passed. She said she hadn't had a reason to hang it until now. "It sounds like hope," Maggie said when it rang for the first time. By Friday, the Driftwood Cafe wasn't just back in business, it was blooming. Evelyn kept the menu smaller and simpler, just as Dan had suggested during the hard weeks: fewer options, more soul. Her blueberry scones, now dubbed storm survivors, became local legend. A couple from 2 towns over even asked to buy a dozen for their anniversary picnic. As the cafe reopened in full, the rhythm returned. But something else pulsed beneath the surface now. Something unspoken between Dan and Evelyn. A tension both tender and charged. Their conversations had grown longer. Glances lingered. Silences felt less like pauses and more like preludes. On Saturday night, Evelyn found herself wiping down the new counter while Dan finished putting Maggie's bike in the back storage room. The cafe was closed. Outside the porch, lights glowed golden, catching the edge of dusk as it softened the town into quiet. Evelyn stared at the darkened coffee machine, heart beating a little too fast. She heard Dan's footsteps before she saw him. "Porch is clear," he said. "No bikes left to trip over. No kids left to trip on me." She smiled. "Thanks, that bike rack's going to save a lot of broken shins." He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "It's funny, when I got here I thought I'd be gone in a week, a month tops. Just long enough to get Maggie stable again, pick up the pieces, move on." And now, Dan looked at her quiet. "Now I wake up and I don't want to be anywhere else." Evelyn felt the floor shift beneath her. Not literally, but emotionally, the way things do when someone says what you've been too careful to admit out loud. "Sometimes I walk through the cafe before it opens," she said softly. "I touch the tables, straighten the salt shakers. It sounds silly, but it makes me feel like I still have a say in the day. Like the mess of life can't touch me here." "It's not silly," Dan said. "It's brave." They stood like that for a while, still grounded. The air between them filled with years of pain they didn't need to explain, and the strange, blooming safety of this fragile new bond. Evelyn broke the silence with a laugh. "Maggie told me today I should just kiss you already." Dan chuckled. "She's not subtle. She's also 8 wise beyond her years," he murmured. Another pause, then Evelyn took a step forward. The space between them disappeared in a breath. Dan didn't move. He didn't need to. "I'm scared," she admitted, voice trembling. Of doing this wrong, of needing too much. Dan raised a hand and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I'm scared too, he said. But being scared doesn't mean we're not ready, just means we care. And then slow, natural, inevitable. He kissed her. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, just the quiet press of lips that had both forgotten what it was like to be kissed with reverence, not rescue. It was a kiss that didn't ask for anything, only promised, I'm here, I see you. When they finally pulled apart, Evelyn's eyes were glassy, but she was smiling. I don't want this to be a mistake, she whispered. Dan touched her cheek. Then let's make it real. One day at a time. Behind them, the wind chimes swayed in the soft evening breeze, filling the porch with a delicate tinkling music. Later that night, they sat on the porch steps, sharing a blanket and a plate of leftover scones. Maggie slept inside, curled up on the cushioned bench with a half-finished comic book in her lap. The street was quiet, the town slow and hushed in its Saturday slumber. I used to think love was fire, Evelyn said. Big, bright, impossible to miss. But maybe it's actually this steady, gentle something that holds you up when everything else has fallen down. Dan nodded. It's the porch that stays standing. They watched the stars come out one by one in a sky scrubbed clean by recent storms, and in the soft peace of that moment, neither of them needed to say anything more. The silence between them was full. Sunday mornings at the Driftwood Cafe had a special kind of rhythm, slower, more reflective. The regulars came in later, sometimes with newspapers, sometimes with grandkids in tow. The smell of cinnamon rolls lingered longer in the air, and no one seemed to mind waiting a little extra for their coffee. That morning, Maggie was unusually quiet. She sat at her usual booth with her colored pencils and a large sheet of white cardstock Evelyn had given her from the office supply drawer. Her brow was furrowed, her tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth in concentration. Dan noticed it as he poured sugar into the large dispenser. Working on a masterpiece, he asked. Maggie didn't look up. It's for the art contest at school. Mrs. Hart said the theme is, someone who inspires you. Dan leaned closer. You drawing me wearing a superhero cape? Maggie rolled her eyes but grinned. Maybe he ruffled her hair and went back behind the counter where Evelyn was wiping down the espresso machine with quiet focus. Their routine had become something unspoken. Dan managed mornings, Evelyn took over midday, and Maggie bounced between them like a comet tethered to two small planets. By noon, the cafe was full. The garden tables outside shimmered under soft, spring light, and laughter floated in through the open windows. Maggie finished her drawing and slipped into the back office, asking Evelyn if she could keep it there until she turned it in. You don't want to show your dad? Evelyn asked, not yet. I want it to be a surprise. Evelyn gave a conspiratorial nod. We'll keep it safe. That afternoon, after the lunch crowd faded, Evelyn stood in the back hallway, staring at the drawing Maggie had pinned to the bulletin board. It was simple colored pencil, bold strokes, and the unmistakable perspective of a child. But it was powerful in its honesty. The image showed the cafe's new porch. Standing at the center was Dan holding a hammer in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. Beside him, Evelyn stood with her apron tied crookedly, smiling. In the foreground, Maggie sat cross-legged, drawing above them, written in Maggie's careful handwriting. My dad and Ms. Evelyn. They fix things. Evelyn's throat tightened. She stood there for a long time, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the bulletin board, as if anchoring herself. It wasn't just a drawing. It was a snapshot of something real. Something earned. Dan found her there a few minutes later. You okay? He asked, stepping softly into the space. She nodded, blinking quickly. She sees us. The way we really are. Dan looked at the drawing, then back at Evelyn. She always has. The next day, Evelyn called a friend who worked at the local printer. By the end of the week, a framed copy of Maggie's drawing hung proudly on the cafe wall, just to the left of the register, where everyone could see it. Customers paused to study it. Some smiled. Some grew quiet. A few even asked if they could leave a sticky note beneath it with their own message, gratitude, encouragement, or simply the words, thank you. Dan caught Evelyn watching the wall one slow afternoon. She was standing there with a dish towel in hand, unmoving, just staring at the cluster of handwritten notes that had appeared beneath the drawing. "You've built something more than a business," he said, his voice low. "You know that, right?" She turned to look at him. "No, we built it." He smiled. That evening, a light rain tapped against the cafe windows. Maggie was curled up in the reading nook, asleep with a library book resting on her chest. Evelyn and Dan sat at one of the front tables. The lights dimmed, the doors locked. "You ever think we got lucky?" she asked suddenly. Dan sipped his tea. "I think we worked hard. I think we kept showing up, and yeah, maybe luck played its part." She studied him across the table. "Sometimes I forget what life felt like before all this. Before the cafe became a place where I stopped pretending I was fine." He reached across and took her hand. "You don't have to pretend anymore." The words settled between them, soft as the rain, solid as the table they leaned against. Then Evelyn looked toward the drawing on the wall again. "Do you think Maggie really sees us as people who fix things?" Dan tilted his head. "Maybe she sees us as people who don't give up." "That's more important." Evelyn didn't answer right away. Then she stood, walked to the wall, and beneath Maggie's drawing, she added her own sticky note, plain, written in her graceful handwriting. "We're still learning how. And that's okay." Dan joined her there, standing beside her in the golden hush of the cafe's closing hour. They didn't need to speak. Outside, the rain softened to mist, and the porch lights flickered gently. Inside, surrounded by pictures, notes, and the scent of cinnamon and fresh hope, they stood together. Not perfect, not finished, but very much whole. The Halberton Spring Fair arrived with the first true warmth of the season. Sunlight bold and unfiltered music floating from loudspeakers strung across Main Street, and booths blooming like wildflowers along every sidewalk. The Driftwood Cafe closed early that Saturday, not for lack of business, but because Evelyn had finally allowed Dan to convince her they belonged among the crowd. Not just behind their counter, Maggie had been rehearsing her part in the school's poetry showcase for weeks. She was slated to perform mid-afternoon right after the mayor's dog walking contest and just before the community bake-off judging. Evelyn stood backstage, if one could call the raised platform near the library, a stage adjusting Maggie's collar, brushing crumbs from her cheek. "You nervous?" she asked. Maggie shook her head. "Not really. It's not as scary as open mic night, and Dad's here." Dan, standing nearby with a juice box in one hand and his phone camera at the ready, winked at his daughter. "Break a leg." Maggie walked out into the bright sunlight like she'd done it 100 times before. Her voice was clear, her words thoughtful, her gaze steady. Dan barely breathed, but it wasn't Maggie's poem that became the talk of the afternoon. It was what happened next, after Maggie took her bow and the applause faded. The announcer tapped the mic awkwardly. "We have one more speaker," he said, Mr. Dan Carter, who I think has a few words to share. Dan turned sharply to Evelyn. "You did this," he whispered. She shook her head, surprised I didn't. Maggie giggled. Dan stepped up to the platform amid polite applause. He wasn't dressed for attention, just jeans, boots, and a clean shirt he'd ironed that morning. His palms were suddenly slick with sweat. He cleared his throat. Wasn't planning to say anything today." He began, eyes flicking over the crowd, catching familiar faces, customers, neighbors, the mailman, the librarian, a few truckers from the highway diner. "But someone signed me up, and I'm guessing they knew I had something to say that I hadn't quite found the courage to say out loud." A murmur of laughter rippled through the crowd. He looked toward the back where Evelyn stood frozen, her hand resting over her heart. "I came to Halberton a few months ago with nothing but a daughter, a truck that stalled every other day, and a toolbox I hadn't touched since my life fell apart." The crowd grew still. "I didn't come here looking for a new beginning. I came looking for a place to survive. But then something happened. I walked into a cafe, and a woman asked me if I believed in destiny. A smile tugged at the corners of several mouths, and back then I said no. Because how could I? Everything I believed in had been taken from me. My wife, my work, my pride." He paused, voice thickening. "But since then, I've watched my daughter laugh again. I've watched her draw and sing and talk about the future, like it's something we get to choose again. And I've worked alongside a woman who's stronger than she knows, who rebuilt her life with her bare hands and gave me without ever saying it out loud. A reason to believe that maybe I didn't come here by accident, He looked directly at Evelyn now. I don't know if I believe in destiny, but I believe in you. The crowd held its collective breath. I believe in the way you keep going. When you're tired, I believe in the way you care for this town. I believe in the way you've made a home, not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever walked into that cafe and left feeling a little more whole. He stepped away from the microphone, chest heaving. A single clap sounded, then another. Then the entire square erupted into applause. Evelyn pressed a hand to her mouth, tears blurring her vision. When Dan stepped off the platform, she met him halfway. "You idiot," she whispered, tears running down her cheeks. "I know," he said softly, "but I couldn't keep it in anymore." She pulled him into a kiss, not shy, not uncertain, but full of all the things they'd been holding inside. The crowd burst into cheers, whistles, and the sound of someone shaking a tambourine. Later that evening, back at the cafe, the three of them sat on the new porch steps as dusk settled in. Maggie sipped a root beer float and kicked her legs lazily. "You didn't tell me you were going to say all that," she said to her dad. "I didn't know I was going to." Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. "You meant every word, every single one." The porch light came on, casting a soft glow over the wooden beams, the flower boxes, the little wind chime still ringing faintly from the breeze. "I think people saw the real you today," Evelyn murmured. Dan wrapped an arm around her. "That's only because I finally saw him too. And for the first time, his voice didn't carry the weight of doubt. Just truth." Summer arrived quietly in Halberton, not with fanfare or fireworks, but with long days that smelled of honeysuckle and fresh soil, and nights lit by fireflies over the back garden of the Driftwood Cafe. The porch, now a familiar fixture of the neighborhood, had become more than an entryway. It was a place where old men played checkers after breakfast, where teenagers sat awkwardly during first dates with iced coffees, where parents rocked strollers back and forth while sipping their morning brews. Dan stood at the counter one Saturday morning, adjusting the coffee grinder with a familiarity that no longer surprised him. The cafe bustled. Evelyn moved behind him, with the same quiet grace she always had, her hand brushing his every now and then in that subtle, steady rhythm they'd fallen into. Maggie Freshly, 9, sat near the register, with her latest sketchbook, flipping pages, looking proud. "I think I want to turn some of my drawings into cards," she announced. "Cards?" Evelyn asked, raising an eyebrow. "For the customers, like thank you cards, or ones that say, 'You're doing your best.' Our people should get more of those." Evelyn leaned down and kissed the top of Maggie's head. "I'd put that on the wall in a heartbeat." Dan smiled, wiping down the counter. "Looks like we've got an artist entrepreneur in the family." Maggie echoed, eyes bright. Dan froze, realizing what he'd just said aloud. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. Then she slipped her hand into his and squeezed gently. "Sounds right," she said softly. That evening, after the cafe had closed and the lanterns in the garden glowed against the soft navy sky, they sat outside, just the three of them. Maggie lay in the grass, naming the constellations she could remember. Dan sat beside Evelyn on the bench he'd built months ago, her head resting on his shoulder. "I used to think life had to be big to mean something." Evelyn said that you had to make headlines or open a Michelin-starred restaurant or prove something to someone. Dan looked out across the garden where the wildflowers Maggie had helped plant were now in full bloom. And now he asked. Now she said, her voice warm. "I think if you can create one small place in the world where people feel safe, where they feel loved and seen, that's more than enough." Dan wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "We've got that right here." She nodded, "And I don't want to run from it anymore. I don't want to plan the next thing. I just want to be here with you." With her. With this, Dan smiled. "Then let's stay, choose it. Not because we have no other options, but because this us is worth choosing." Evelyn blinked quickly. The air between them, warm and thick with late summer softness, held the weight of something beautiful, unshakable. Inside the cafe, the wind chime at the window caught a breeze and rang gently, a sound that had become, over time, less of a decoration and more of a signal. A heartbeat. Maggie sat up and pointed to the sky. "There's Orion." "That's a winter constellation," Dan said, laughing. "Maybe he's early." She shrugged. "Or maybe he just missed us." Evelyn chuckled. "I'd come early too if I could sit here." The three of them sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind, to the distant sound of laughter from the houses down the road, to the occasional clink of dishes being washed in the kitchen behind them. Dan turned to Evelyn. "Do you remember the first thing you ever said to me?" She grinned. "About 20 different sarcastic things come to mind?" "No," he said. "You asked me if I believed in destiny." She smiled wider. "Now I didn't I said no," he said, his voice soft. "But I think I do now. Or at least I believe in this, whatever brought me to that porch. Whatever gave me a second chance." Evelyn leaned in. "Maybe it wasn't destiny. Maybe it was just kindness. Meeting, readiness. A broken heart finding another," Dan nodded. "Whatever it was, I'm not letting go of it." They kissed, then not the cautious, breathless kiss of beginnings, but the kind of kiss that felt like home, rooted certain, a seal on something sacred. Maggie sighed dramatically. "You guys are cute, but also very cheesy." They both laughed, pulling her into a hug between them. And beneath the soft lights of the porch, under a sky not quite dark, not quite full, a small cafe in a forgotten town held three people who had once lost everything and found in each other something quietly miraculous. Not a fairy tale, but a life chosen, shared, enduring, and enough. Where in the world are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let us know your city or country. It always warms our hearts to see how far these stories travel. If this story touched you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of hope, healing, and unexpected connection. Your support means more than words can say. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and take care.